waivers related to Palestinian terrorism and implementing sanctions against those terrorists?
Yes.
Can you commit to ending discriminatory policies, including Biden administration's secret boycott policies against Jews in Judea and Samaria?
Yes.
And can you commit to reversing the discriminatory sanctions against Jews living in Judea and Samaria?
Again, yes. I think that the policy of, again, without speaking out of turn, I'm confident in saying that President Trump's administration will continue to be perhaps the most pro-Israel administration in American history.
And the final question, you and I talked at great length about the 1944 water treaty with Mexico. Mexico is in violation of that treaty. It is doing enormous damage to South Texas. Farmers and ranchers there are experiencing drought. As the Secretary of State, tell me what the State Department can do to encourage and incentivize Mexico to comply with the treaty and provide the water that they are obligated to provide to the people of South Texas.
I think raise it in every engagement. We will be engaged with Mexican partners. We have to engage with the Mexican government, and it's important to elevate it and raise it at every one of those engagements. And I don't just mean like sending a letter or somebody sending an email or just mentioning it. I'm saying making it a priority, and it's a priority not just because it matters to Texas. It's a priority because these international agreements and arrangements only work if they're complied with. And if they're not complied with, and it becomes habitual, other nations believe they can begin to violate them as well. It undermines this entire commitment to multilateral agreements and so forth. And I think it's in the crevices of those agreements, whether they've been in place for a long time and no one's paying attention anymore, or it just doesn't matter enough and you ignore it because you don't want to destabilize the rest of your relationship, but it encourages it to happen more and more. It is not the only irritant we have in our bilateral relationship with them and in our agreements. I imagine they have some with us as well. But it's one that needs to be prioritized and raised consistently as a priority, not just as an asterisk or a footnote.
Thank you, and you're going to do great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say, Senator Rubio, I want to start off by noting for the record that when I first got to the Senate and I was in my first year and you just run for president, and I didn't think you would know who I was. I was pregnant with my daughter and trying to change Senate rules so that I could bring her onto the floor so I could do my job and vote, because I can't come through the normal back door to vote because there's stairs there and it's not accessible for wheelchairs. And I remember in the middle of that battle, rolling through the Senate floor to vote, and I heard, "Tammy Duckworth," from across the Senate chambers, and you came running down from the top back of the Senate chambers to tell me, "I'm with you, I will support you, you have the right to vote, and I will support you being able to bring your daughter, your child onto the floor when she's born." And I want to thank you for that kindness, because you did speak to your leadership about it. And it was a moment of true bipartisanship, but also as parents. And as someone who was new to the Senate, I was extremely grateful to you for that kindness.
I think what I exactly said is, what's the big deal? This place is already full of babies.
Exactly, exactly. So I want to touch on a topic we discussed last month. Thank you for sitting down with me. I always appreciate the opportunity to sit down with nominees. I appreciate also your earlier response to Senator McCormick about Americans detained abroad and your commitment to tackling this head on. As you and I also discussed last month, I appreciate your attention and commitment to addressing the case of Illinoisans in particular that we discussed as well. Thank you for that. Another topic, you already touched on some of the issues in the Indo-Pacific, particularly around the PRC and the DPRK, but I'd like to dive back into the issue of ASEAN and the ASEAN nations. Since coming to the Senate, I make a point of visiting Southeast Asia annually to reinforce our friends and partners there, and those that we want to become our friends and partners there, that the United States, and particularly those of us in the Senate, care deeply about these long-standing historic relationships and making sure that those relationships live up to their potential. And as you know, respect for ASEAN centrality has been a core part of our foreign policy in that region. In fact, the first Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy correctly emphasized ASEAN centrality as an important principle. Unfortunately, not all of President Trump's nominees this time seems to grasp the importance or in fact know what ASEAN is. Yesterday, I was distinctly unimpressed when questioning Secretary of Defense nominee Hegseth that he could not mention a single nation in ASEAN, particularly shameful when we have at least two major non-NATO allies in the bloc, one of which, Thailand, is the longest treaty alliance that the United States has, at over 190 years long. What can you share with us today about how you would approach ASEAN as a whole and with individual member states to capitalize on some of the key opportunities and challenges facing the region? I know you've spoken about the Philippines, but can you
Sure.
build on that?
Sure. ASEAN, the first thing is, I mean, the group's utility begins by the fact that through its 10 members, they've also, I believe, have 5 or maybe it's 6 free trade agreements now with neighboring countries as well. Look, though we have to be very pragmatic in our approach and how we prioritize it. I think the group will always struggle to coordinate unanimity on the issue of their relationship with China. Okay, if you look at the continental, Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, because of their geographic presence, because of history, they lean a little bit more in the Chinese direction, and other countries do not. I think it would be a mistake for us to sort of make it as a condition of our engagement with ASEAN to say, you must pick a side, and you must pick a side now. Are you with them, or are you with us? I think what I can safely say is that the overwhelming and vast majority of the nation states in ASEAN, if not maybe all, do not want to live in a region in which China is the predominant power and they are viewed as tributary states to Beijing, and welcome U.S. engagement in the region as both an economic and defense counterweight. And so I think we need to view this as, it would be a mistake to go in with sort of a Cold War mentality of pick a side and pick a side now. I think the broader approach is to say they have a vested interest in us being involved. We have a vested interest as an Indo-Pacific nation in involving ourselves through this forum and finding opportunities, both holistically through the 10 nations and individually through whatever bilateral opportunities present itself. Earlier, you may not have been here, but I was asked a question about Thailand, and there is a group of Uyghurs that are in Thailand that they're saying may be deported. And I said, this is one of our strongest, longest relationships in the region, and maybe one of the longest and strongest in the world. And that's where these relationships really come to bear, not to browbeat them in a public forum, but through strong diplomacy and using the benefit of that relationship to go to Thailand and see if we can't get them to not deport these people into the hands of Chinese authorities, knowing the atrocities that have been committed. So that's a value added to this relationship. That is a bilateral relationship we have with Thailand. It's not the one we're going to have with every country in the region, but I do think the forum serves as a useful platform for us to be able to engage the region and individually these countries.
So you would agree with what the first Trump administration emphasized, which is that ASEAN centrality. And I think this is something that the new ASEAN chair, Malaysia, under Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, is saying with the Mandani concept, which is growing that cohesion within ASEAN itself and in dealing with the organization while we continue to pursue those bilateral relationships. But the stronger ASEAN can be cohesively as a unit, allows them to better deal with countries like Myanmar, for example, and allows us to better have those relations with them, and also for them cohesively to try to stand up to outside forces.
One of the things that I think, and I think you saw this in the first Trump term, and we'll probably see again, is to the extent you see production sort of moving from China to other countries, some of these countries stand to benefit from that, assuming they themselves are not the target of some tariff or what have you. But I think there are benefits there in that regard. I would imagine that there are also some concerns they would share with us about maybe some of our other policies, economic or otherwise. But I do think it's an opportunity that provides some real economic development benefit opportunities for a number of the countries in ASEAN. We would hope all of them, but certainly some more than others because of alignment of interests. What I do think is we have to be realistic, and I just want to reiterate this because I think sometimes we go into these things viewing them with the lens of NATO or something else. The key component to understand is we are probably never going to have sort of a overwhelming majority consensus on the role China is going to play. But I do think you could argue that the vast majority of countries in this forum, if not all, do not want to live in a region in which China is the predominant, overwhelming power, and they all are viewed as sort of tributary states. They are not interested in that, and they view the United States as a very logical and welcome economic and defense counterweight to that.
Yeah. And I do think that even the mainland ASEAN nations that, as you, in your words, are lean more towards China, have suffered. If you look at what happens with water, we talked a lot about Mexico and water into Texas, but also with the Mekong River in ASEAN, with the 10 dams that China has built upriver is now affecting water and also arable lands further down the river, and initiatives like the Two Rivers Initiative, which marries the Mississippi River, which is 2/3 of the border of my home state, along with the Mekong River, is a way for us to build some of these relationships and bring in American expertise. A different place where we can also provide expertise is international disability rights. We have been working with ASEAN on developing disability rights and a cohesive approach to it in ASEAN, but I think on an international scale, whether it's ASEAN or Ukraine as they rebuild, I do think that disability awareness, rebuilding Ukraine to become more accessible, promoting disability rights around the world is something that is a way that we can engage with the rest of the world as well. Love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I
your
say this,
commitment to disability rights around the world.
and I say this, sadly, it's going to be of critical importance to nations that are emerging from conflict, where we know modern conflict, people are injured in ways that are now survivable, but leave them for the rest of their lives with permanent disability. And so I think it's going to be, in the case, from a very practical perspective, in the case of Ukraine, it's going to be valuable because there are people that have been injured in that conflict that for the rest of their lives are going to have to deal with that, and it's conducive. The other thing we've discussed is our diplomatic facilities around the world and whether they are, and understand that the number one job, the reason why we have embassies and consulates, yes, we represent U.S. interests in that country, but its number one obligation is to support Americans. If you lose your passport, if God forbid you go to jail, whatever it may be, that we have a presence there that can support Americans abroad. And it was stunning for me in our conversation to learn that there are a number of these locations around the world that are not accessible to Americans with disabilities that needed to access them. So it's something that we would have to look, we'd be interested in looking at as well to make sure that just from our core obligation, we're able to fulfill it.
And also, it keeps many of your own staff members who may have disabilities from serving in some of these overseas missions. As you said, highly trained, well-qualified regional experts, subject matter experts may not be able to serve in some of these embassies where they can't it's not accessible for them. So I thank you for bringing that up. And I will yield back my 9 seconds, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So generous.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator Duckworth. Those are important points. Last but not least, welcome back, Senator Lee, to the committee, and appreciate you've had your work cut out for you today and your new role as chairman of your committee. But the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Senator Rubio, for your willingness to serve in this position. I'm going to make a bold prediction and say that you are likely to be confirmed. That's my prediction. I can't speak for others, but I believe that nonetheless, and it's a bittersweet moment. I'm back on the committee after 12 years of being away from it. You and I came to this committee and to the Senate at the same time, both in our late 30s, the youngest members of the Senate at the time, although you have me by exactly 7 days, 7 days older. Notwithstanding the fact that you were the older between us, you've got all of your hair, and it's not a single gray hair in there. But I've deeply enjoyed working with you as a colleague and getting to know you as a friend. We have kids that are about the same age, and I've watched yours grow, and it's just been a delight getting to know you, Jeanette, and your kids, and I hope that'll continue. But I'll miss having you here, not only as my Spanish teacher, not only as my source of Bible insights and my source of comedic material, but also for your great insights on foreign policy, domestic policy, and everything else we do here. You've just been great to work with, and you will be missed in the very likely event that you are confirmed. Let's talk first about the Western Hemisphere, an issue that I know is near and dear to your heart and mine. And we'll start with the Panama Canal. President Trump has recently talked a little bit about the fact that there are some questions arising about the status of the Panama Canal. When we look to the treaty at issue, the treaty concerning the permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal, we're reminded that some things maybe aren't quite as they should be there right now, given that the Chinese now control major ports at the entry and the exit to the canal. It seems appropriate to say that there's at least an open question. There's some doubt as to whether the canal remains neutral. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, and yes, here's the challenge. Number one is, look, I want to be clear about something. The Panamanian government, particularly its current office holders, are very friendly to the United States and very cooperative, and we want that to continue. And I want to bifurcate that from the broader issue of the canal. Now, President Trump is not inventing this. This is something that's existed now for at least a decade in my service here. I took a trip to Panama in 2017. When on that trip to Panama in 2017, it was the central issue we discussed about the canal. And that is that Chinese companies control port facilities at both ends of the canal, the east and the west. And the concerns among military officials and security officials, including in Panama at that point, that that could one day be used as a choke point to impede commerce in a moment of conflict. That's going back to that. But before you got here, and I don't want to have to dig through this folder to find it again, but basically cited that how the immediate past head of Southern Command, just retired General Richardson, said she flew over the canal, looked down and saw those Chinese port facilities and said, those look like dual-use facilities that in a moment of conflict could be weaponized against us. The bipartisan China Commission over in the House last year had testimony and hearings on this issue, and members of both parties expressed concern. The former ambassador to Panama that served under President Obama has expressed those concerns. This is a legitimate issue that needs to be confronted. The second point is the one you touched upon, and that is, look, could an argument be made? And I'm not prepared to answer it yet because it's something we're going to have to study very carefully, but I think I have an inkling of I know where this is going to head. Can an argument be made that the Chinese basically have effective control of the canal anytime they want? Because if they order a Chinese company that controls the ports to shut it down or impede our transit, they will have to do so. There is no independent Chinese companies. They all exist because they've been identified as national champions. They're supported by the Chinese government, and if you don't do what they want, they find a new CEO, and you end up being replaced and removed. So they're on the complete control of their government. This is a legitimate question, and one that Senator Risch had some insight as well. He mentioned that in passing, that needs to be looked at. This is not a joke. The Panama Canal issue is a very serious one.
And so the mere potentiality of that, the ability to exercise that control, even until such time as they do it, as they do shut it down, is a concern, is it not?
Well, I listened 48 hours ago to FBI Director Wray in one of his exit interviews he gave to the press, and he said the Chinese are embedded in our utilities and critical infrastructure. Now, he didn't say every single day they're shutting off the power in the United States. He said that if there's a conflict, they're embedded and they could shut off the power in key places. We've all identified that as a threat. The fact that you can do it, you don't have to do it every day. No one's claiming that the Chinese are shutting down the canal every day. What the claim is, the very legitimate concern is, that if these companies control both ends of that canal in a time of conflict and the Chinese tell them, shut it down and don't let the U.S. go through there, we got a big, big problem, a big economic problem and a big national security and defense problem. The ability to do it alone is a threat. We shouldn't ignore it. It isn't a joke. It's a legitimate issue, and it needs to be solved.
Excellent. And that feeds right into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which involves areas of dual-use capabilities throughout the Western Hemisphere. Ports, infrastructure, critical minerals, and so forth. We've had policies from the Biden administration involving the supercilious use of untargeted foreign aid and sort of cultural coercion in order to persuade them to, or in an effort to coerce some of these countries to adopt policies that are contrary to their established cultural norms, abortion rights, LGBT policies and curriculum, and so forth. That probably hasn't helped in this conflict, in this still somewhat soft conflict in which many of these countries are opening their doors to China. I can't imagine that will have helped. How will your approach to Chinese incursion in the Western Hemisphere be different from those of the current administration?
Well, there are a couple points. The first is the Chinese incursion in the hemisphere involves, number one, investment of dollars. Like, as an example, they go into some country, they say, here's $5 million or $10 million to build a stadium, but in exchange, you have to let us build out your 5G network using Huawei, safe cities, and the like. And by the way, here's a couple $1 million for you and your friends as a bribe. Okay, that's their first level of engagement. They go in and then in some ways they create deals that you can not possibly pay back. So now you've got a debt that you can't pay back, and they have you trapped. And now they've got your vote at the UN and your cooperation on X, Y, and Z. And that happened in Panama, by the way. In 2016, 2017, that was well understood that part of the investments they made in Panama were conditioned upon Panama's ability to convince the Dominican Republic and other countries to flip their recognition away from Taiwan. That happened. So that's number one. The second element of their involvement is they go into a country and a Chinese company will buy up the lithium mines or access to the rare earth minerals in these long-term contracts. And that exists in allied countries. The Argentines will tell you there are a number of business deals that the Chinese and Chinese companies have gotten a hold of in Argentina that even if they wanted to back away, they can't get out of the deals because of the way they were structured. So that's number two. And then number three is their presence. The Chinese are actively involved in military installations in the Western Hemisphere on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from our shores. Only a few hundred miles from where Space Force operates and NASA and Cape Canaveral. Only a few miles from MacDill, where we have Central Command and Special Operations Command. Only a few miles from Southern Command. Only a few miles from Eglin Air Force Base and the test range we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. All of these things, this is real, and it's operating right off the coast of the United States. They have a presence in our region. So we have to acknowledge that this is happening, and then we have to be present and have counters to each of these, and/or there has to be consequences for each of these. Fortunately, the United States has strong relationships in multiple key countries in the region, and I think we have the opportunity to build upon that and in ways that can attract the sort of investment that they would rather have than the Chinese investment. But right now it's not available. It's not happening. There is no American alternative to what the Chinese are offering. So hopefully we can provide the openings for that.
Indeed, and I appreciate your enthusiasm and thoughtfulness in providing that answer. Now, you touch on another issue when you reference the significance of agreements made by prior administrations. Obviously, the Javier Milei administration in Argentina wouldn't have been as likely to enter into those arrangements as his predecessor was. The United States, we have to keep this in mind. The Constitution, of course, allocates the treaty-making and binding power. It spreads it out between two branches. The president can enter into a treaty, can sign a treaty, but that treaty isn't ratified unless 2/3 of the Senate does it. So it flips the usual legislative process because it's a different type of legislation. Would you agree with me that that type of arrangement, which is submission of a treaty after the president has entered into it, after the president has signed it, the submission of that treaty to the Senate for ratification and the ultimate ratification by the Senate is a necessary precondition for an international agreement to be binding on the United States of America?
To be binding beyond the administration that entered into it. This was the case of the JCPOA, which was being sold to people as a treaty, but it wasn't. And the reason why it was a political agreement. It's basically a political arrangement between the current administration and the regime in Iran, and that's why President Trump had the authority to pull us out of it when he did. I think what's important to understand about treaties in general, and we talked about treaties here today with Mexico. There are a number of other treaties that people may not be aware of. Every treaty, by definition, okay, is a surrender of sovereignty at some level as a nation. But you do it and you enter into it. Why? Why do you enter into a treaty even though you're surrendering some sovereignty? Because you've concluded that that surrender and the benefit of it to the national interest or the national security far outweighs the surrender of sovereignty and the consequences of it. And that is why it's so critical that the Senate be involved in that deliberation, because an individual administration may get that calculus wrong. But when you have this overwhelming majority that concludes that it too agrees that that surrender of sovereignty is exceeded by the benefit of the treaty, now you know you've increased your chances of have something that's good and makes sense. And so I agree with your view of it, and I think that's the way I would hope we would pursue arrangements in the future if we enter into any.
That's why it takes 2/3. Thank you so much, Senator Rubio. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rubio, we know you have an appointment at the White House at 3 o'clock. Senator Shaheen has one brief question for you. I have a couple of brief remarks, and then we'll get you on your way.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Rubio. I think that was a very impressive display of your knowledge of the global situation. But the one area that you mentioned, but we haven't really talked about, is the Arctic. And given what's happening in the Arctic and China's designs on the Arctic, can you just speak to what you think our posture ought to be with respect to the Arctic?
Well, we're an Arctic power. The Russians, legitimate Arctic power. The Chinese are not. Whether they're near Arctic power or I don't know what the term they came up with to give an excuse for them to be up there.
Crazy.
I think, frankly, I know you didn't ask me this question, but it's one I welcome the ability to talk about in some of this discussion with Greenland, putting aside all the things that are going on in the media. I think we need to understand that Greenland has been strategically important to the United States and to the West for a very long time. In fact, in 1941, at the outbreak of World War II, the United States was signed up as a protectorate, even though the Denmark had been occupied. You think back into I think Harry Truman tried to buy Denmark. Harry Truman had made an effort to try to buy it for like $100 million. He was rebuffed. And then the U.S. has maintained through a mutual defense agreement there the opportunity to to have military bases, and it had them for a while. Why? The reason why is because of where it's located geographically. Yes, the access to the minerals on Greenland are critically important. But as more navigable space is opening up in the Arctic, particularly this northern passage that goes from Russia to China, Russia to Asia, and could cut transit times by as much as 40%, the Arctic is going to become incredibly critical. And so we have to have a presence there. We have to have a presence there, not just saying, okay, we have a base, we have 200 people, or we have a flag flying. We have to have the ability, for example, to have the ships that can navigate on the naval level and keep those shipping lanes open if, in fact, they're being threatened. We have to have partners along the Arctic region that will join us in ensuring that the Arctic region is open for free and flow of navigation as these passages open up, because global trade is in many ways going to be infused by it. We have positions within the State Department that I think in the past have been diminished or people just haven't paid a lot of attention to. And I just had this conversation the other day with Senator Murkowski that all of a sudden I think people are interested in serving in Arctic affairs and in Arctic posts, because this issue of Greenland has opened our eyes to the broader geographic importance of the Arctic region, which long has been a curiosity or something people have not talked about. But I think now we have the opportunity to see it for what it is. And that is, one, if not the most important, one of the most critical parts of the world over the next 50 to 100 years will be whether there's going to be freedom of navigation in the Arctic and what that will mean for global trade and commerce.
Thank you. I'm going to order that Senator Rubio's responses, written responses to the questions regarding his relationship with this committee be filed for the record. I'm also going to order that the letters in support of Senator Rubio's confirmation be entered in the record. And finally, I want to say thank you, Senator Rubio, for providing us with the benefit of your testimony, your responses, and your knowledge. It was outstanding. This committee takes oversight of U.S. foreign assistance extremely seriously. You know well that transparency and accountability are paramount. To that end, I want to flag for you my work with the Office of the Inspector General on the State Department's Bureau for Global Health, Security, and Diplomacy, PEPFAR, and the Biden administration's failure to uphold long-standing United States laws protecting life in global health assistance. In addition to my request for an investigation, I've been holding over $1 billion in U.S. foreign assistance since September of last year, and will continue to do so until I can be sure that not one single American tax dollar will be used to perform or promote abortions overseas, as that is required by U.S. law. I look forward to working with you on this, in addition to the many issues that we discussed here today. Finally, I will note for the information of members of the committee that the record will remain open until tomorrow, Thursday, January 16th at 1 p.m. For members to submit questions for the record. Thank you. God bless you. We wish you well. Committee is adjourned.